part one, we established the chronology of Jesus' movements and interactions prior to his calling of the two brothers, which we followed in Mark chapter 1. Here we examine the characteristics of Yahweh that might have resonated with Israel to entrust their lives with him while in the midst of the captivity in Egypt. We will then revisit the brothers by the Sea of Galilee as they exited their boats. Exodus chapters 3 and 4 are two of the richest chapters in the Hebrew Bible describing God's love and compassion towards Israel. It starts with Moses approaching a burning bush, a fire that was not consuming the bush itself. Instead, within the midst of this burning bush, God spoke. We read in Exodus 3, Yahweh sharing with Moses his attentiveness to the Israelites' plight of slavery. Here he communicates that he has seen their tears and he has heard their cries, which moved him to action where he promises their rescue. The chiastic structure seen in Exodus 3, 7 through 9, centers on this action of rescue. It's interesting to note that even God's radical action was prefaced by first seeing and hearing. These senses were engaged to process that there was a tremendous issue that needed rectification. Sight alone has impact, yet combined with sound, the situation being observed reaches a new dimension. As an example, I remember taking our 2-year-old son to a drive-in movie in Massachusetts. There were 3 movies on the docket, of which the first was a G-rated animation film for kids. Afterwards, the show Mikhail and I wanted to see was Jurassic Park. So Ben enjoyed the first movie, and we were hoping for him to fall asleep for the second movie. He didn't. So we found ourselves having to turn down the volume whenever a dinosaur was chasing a vehicle or any other participants. We would reframe the story as funny so that he would not get alarmed, and it worked. Our auditory senses makes an enormous difference when combined with sight. It can move us to some sort of action, whether fight or flight. According to Rabbi Foreman, Yahweh revealed his understanding of the Israelite plight, the lies that Egypt had promoted and then perpetuated on the Israelites via 3 signs that were displayed to Moses at the bush. Part of the healing process in any wrongful scenario to either an individual or a group is to allow the victimized to be understood and vindicated where lies have been propagated. Yet these signs seem to do more than vindicate. They seem to point to a divine empathy and concern inherent within this deity. Even though a cursory reading of Exodus 4:1 seems to assume that the signs were merely miracles to display God's power through Moses and encourage belief, this reading may dilute the intended impact of what God might be trying to accomplish. The Hebrew word for belief is emunah, a word that seems to extend beyond just intellectual belief. Foreman mentions that this word surfaces again after the Israelites crossed the Sea of Reeds. Here it says they had put their emunah in Yahweh, which seems interesting that they did not have intellectual belief prior to this moment based on their experience of watching the 10 plagues unfold. So the use of emunah does not seem to indicate just an intellectual assent or agreement that God exists, but rather a deep-seated trust or faith which inspires an action towards loyalty. Foreman mentions that the 3 signs were meant to demonstrate who God is, the characteristic of concern and empathy for his people. The 3 signs, as mentioned, might be seen to uncover the lies perpetuated towards the Israelites under Egyptian bondage. These signs were, number 1, were Moses' staff thrown to the ground and becoming a snake, then being picked up by the tail and returning to a snake again. Number 2, of Moses inserting his healthy hand into his cloak, then removing it, showing his leprous skin. Then he returns it to his cloak, takes it out again, showing the skin has returned to normal. The 3rd sign, we see Moses taking water from the Nile and then pouring it on the ground where it turns to blood. These signs would create awe and maybe fear if they were replicated today. However, in that time period, we learned that the Egyptian astrologers were capable of replicating 2 of these signs to some extent. So what might God have been trying to communicate to his people if the signs were not merely for intellectual belief? Exodus 3 verse 16 states, "I have surely redeemed and remembered them and what was done to them in Egypt." The Hebrew language uses redundancy of words to emphasize intensity. The word surely is a translation of the word pakwad, which means to visit with the intention to help. The word is used twice to emphasize its importance. So within this backdrop, God seemed to be displaying his concern for the Israelites and not just giving Moses his stamp of approval. Foreman recognizes the signs seem to be ordered from more obscure to obvious. The third sign, changing Nile water to blood, speaks to the atrocities committed by the Egyptians in killing off all newborn males by throwing their bodies into the Nile. The atrocity is so horrific in that Pharaoh did not just order his military or officials to commit this heinous act, but he called on all Egyptian people, as you see in verse 22, chapter 1, to participate. The Nile would cover over the sins of the Egyptians by its placid nature, where the bodies of these children would lie underneath these waters. Turning the Nile to blood would be viewed by the Israelites as God exposing this lie. Foreman comments on the second sign, the leprous hand, as a sign to expose Pharaoh's attempt at coercing the midwives to kill the male newborns. Foreman makes this connection by seeing that the only other time in the Torah that leprosy is mentioned is found in Numbers 12, where God afflicts Moses' sister with leprosy. Her brother Aaron describes her condition as someone who has died and expresses her condition even more vividly, where he states, "Let her not be as an infant that has just come out of its mother's womb without having its flesh intact, or as a stillborn." If you recall, prior to the final solution of killing all the male newborns in the Nile, Pharaoh tried to enlist the Hebrew midwives to kill the newborns. We can infer the only way for the midwives to hide their true actions would be to tell the mother of that child that the child had died at birth. The two heroic Hebrew midwives who defied Pharaoh's order, Shiphrah and Puah, would have certainly expressed this plan to these Hebrew couples. Yet the damage of the possibility of this plan, not even it being enacted, would have certainly caused consternation with the Israelites. Now, for the first sign, the changing of Moses' staff to a snake, then back to a staff, really speaks toward the lies propagated in Pharaoh's campaign to dehumanize the Hebrew people. How do you get a group of humans to become complicit in such atrocities as were committed on the Israelites? You can see really the propaganda Pharaoh initiated to change the narrative by dehumanizing the Israelites so that the process of elimination would have been more acceptable for the normal human. You can read the Egyptian overtones by the narrator in describing Israel's descent into slavery in Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, where the Israelites are described in insect infestation terms, where the English translation renders the Hebrew word for to swarm in a gentler term as multiplied greatly. Within that same verse, it states that the land was filled with them, very dehumanizing descriptors. Pharaoh continues this campaign by instilling his people with fear by fomenting misinformation about them, about the Israelites aligning with foreign powers to overthrow the Egyptian kingdom. Lastly, he mentions that it would take dealing with them in a shrewd manner, implying that the Israelites exhibited a level of shrewdness or cunning. An Israelite might see these three misinformation traits, that being dangerous, cunning, and non-human, as aligning with the only other creature familiar in the Hebrew text, really the snake from Genesis chapter 3. Foreman mentions that the snake represents the entirety of how the Egyptians were relating to the Israelites. What is really interesting about this postulate is that the Hebrew word for staff is matah, which has the dual meaning of staff but also of tribe. So if we carry this out and seeing what Moses might be doing with the sign is him first holding the tribe of Israel, throwing the true tribe on the ground where it transforms to a snake, indicative of a creature that is non-human, cunning, and dangerous. This character really does seem plausible by viewing Moses' reaction of fear when he's told to pick the snake up by the tail. However, the lie is exposed after the snake is transformed back to a staff or the true tribe of Israel. Taken together, all three signs are not mere magic acts to confirm God is God, but might be to express a belief and trust that moves someone towards action. Seeing empathy on display, where God identifies with their pain, might be the motivational factor that allows them to entrust themselves to Moses' God. Okay, so let's move back to the movement of Peter, Andrew, James, and John prior to their call to follow Jesus. reviewing the moments of engagements they encountered with Jesus, which, if not all, spoke to them, revealing Jesus' heart, that he had their interest in mind. The moment they had traveled, though, through Samaria, rather than bypass it as any Jew would, based on centuries of bigotry, is one significant moment that could have elevated their trust in him. Briefly, in Sychar, Jesus encounters a woman who had come to draw water from a well. We see Jesus breaking social barriers to have a conversation with her. First, he speaks with her, which violated two cultural norms. One, Jews don't associate with Samaritans due to the long-standing issues centered on differences in worship. And two, men don't engage in conversation with women while alone, 1v1. She immediately picks up on this unique interaction where this Jew was bypassing social norms. She also notices he has nothing to draw water with from the well after he asks her for a drink, a scenario that suggests that he either drank from her cup or intended to, which would risk him becoming ritually unclean. Finally, he speaks to her past and current condition, identifying the tragedy of losing 5 husbands, either through divorce or through death. Most commentators see this woman ostracized from her community based on her loose sexual behavior. However, the more plausible scenario is that this woman experienced the difficulties of marriage, especially from the perspective of a woman who had no rights to initiate divorce. Also, on her return to her town, the community listened to her and followed her to see Jesus, an action that would not have occurred for someone shunned due to their lifestyle. And then finally, Jesus never calls for her to leave her life of sin as he did with the woman caught in adultery, as seen in John chapter 8. So what did the brothers see in Jesus in this interaction? Despite Jesus dispelling all the barriers seen between Jews and Samaritans and women, they also heard the story of Jesus speaking to her pain, of her life's difficulties. You know, when we feel heard, it changes a relationship. It did for this woman, and I think for the 2 sets of brothers, and as it did for Moses and the Israelites centuries earlier. To make this jump to follow Jesus was not just an emotional altar call. It was a premeditated decision with a focal point on God's intense caring and concern for man. As the Exodus story inspired loyalty rather than just intellectual belief, the characteristics of belief in Jesus extend beyond just intellectual assent and are captured by the Greek word for belief and faith, which is termed pistis, which points towards loyalty or allegiance. Matthew Bates has written about this nuance in this word, which implies action and activity as well as intellectual belief. This construct of the overlap of belief and allegiance has been documented in ancient literature and fits within the context of many passages in the Gospels and in the letters. Bates puts it best by stating allegiance is a larger category of subsuming the notion of mental assent to the reliability of God's testimony or belief, or to God's promises or trust, while also foregrounding the idea that genuine mental assent goes hand in hand with an allegiant living out of that assent. Kind of deep. In summary, allegiance includes a mental affirmation that the gospel is true, a professed fealty to Jesus alone, and an enacted loyalty through obedience to Jesus the King. Okay, so the brothers were able to see what they needed to in Jesus to make the jump to this loyalty, fealty level, which coincided with their ancestors as these ancients viewed God's signs from the burning bush. What is remarkably interesting is that God asks us to join him in calling out injustice, speaking to harms done by others so that we can partner in the redemption of others. When we read the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus asks us to turn the other cheek to the one who hits us, or to give our coat to the one who asks us only for our shirt, or to walk an extra mile when ordered by a Roman soldier to only walk the first mile, these actions may appear docile at first reading. However, in somewhat a subversive way, these responses may subdue retribution possibly sought by the one harmed, yet expose the wrong perpetrated by the harming party.
What? The pay is lousy, but we get to keep the tips. Nicodemus, the sign is the mile marker. In your entire lives, I bet you've never been so grateful for the enshrined Roman law. We know this has been an honor for all of you. Stop here. I said stop! The destination is that outpost a mile ahead, yes? It is, but we're only permitted 1 mile. By coercion. There's no law against citizens assisting you the rest of the way of their own volition. Come, my friends. But if anyone says anything, say that we offered.
I turn your attention to an excellent article written by the Bible Project team re-examining these actions as a proactive means of exposing injustice. God, in so directing, is letting us know that He sees, that He hears, and that He acts independently and sometimes through us. In doing so, redemption is possible for both the harmed and the one causing the harm. In conclusion, there was a scene in the movie The Hunt for Red October where the CIA operative Jack Ryan is processing how a Russian commander of a nuclear submarine might get his crew off his sub so that the Americans can subversively gain access.
They have to want to get off. How do you get a crew to want to get off a submarine? How do you get a crew to want to get off a nuclear sub?
The key in that scene was the eureka moment where Ryan came to understand the Russian captain's narrative spoken to his crew to prompt them to get out of the boat. The same is for us today. God has provided a narrative that exposes His heart through the ancients and finally His Son. Combined with prompting of His Spirit and through His Spirit's work in Scripture, we all have these data points that can move our hearts to an allegiant faith if we so choose.